This is the first part on a series on the astrological archetypes. And today I want to talk about what is an archetype, basically. So I would like to explain this by doing a little experiment. And after the experiment, I'm going to talk a little bit more about it. And that's going to be the first part of the series for just an introduction to the archetypes. So imagine, for example, a tree. And you look at a tree and someone would ask you, okay, so what do you see? And you say, I see a tree. And I'll say, okay, so what could the tree be part of? What's a group that the tree could be part of? And you could say, okay, well, it's part of plants. It's part of the group of plants. And then I would say, okay, well, what are plants? What group are plants a part of, maybe? And you could say, well, plants are part of nature. And I could say, okay, well, then what is nature part of? And you could say, well, nature is an organism, you know? And at some point I could say, okay, so what does the organism do? And you could say, well, it provides life on the earth. And my next question could be, okay, so what could be the motive behind providing life? Why does nature do this? And that is a question, what would be the motive is kind of a weird question because we don't usually think of nature as like a person or a personal thing that has a motive or desire or whatever. But the archetypes are basically a motive or a desire behind some function in reality. So if I say nature provides life, or the organism, the living organism that nature is, there's a motive behind this. Well, what's the motive of providing life? And at some point, you're going to realize that you're getting to a realm where it's hard to describe, but you kind of have an intuitive notion of what's behind the motive or what the motive could be. But it's somehow behind or beyond words. You can't really say it, but you can kind of feel it. So here's another example, like when I say, what's a screwdriver? You look at a screwdriver and I say, well, what group is this screwdriver part of? And you say, well, it's a tool. And I say, okay, well, what do you use tools for? What group are they part of? And you say, well, you use tools to build houses or build things. And I would say, okay, well, why do you build houses? Why do we do this? Why do we use tools to build things? What's that for? You'd say, well, it's to, establish security or, create a safe space or maintain things. And I'd say, well, what's the point behind that? Why are we doing this? And again, at some point, when I say use words like security, establishing, maintaining, then I'm moving toward a certain feeling about life. And at some point, I run into the point where I can't really say why we do this, but there's still this intuitive kind of feeling to it. Like it has this impulse or this I don't know what you want to call it, energy behind it that you can kind of put it in a box, but the box doesn't have a word to it. Do you know what I mean? So that thing that we can't really name, but it's still somehow there. It's somehow felt. In case of the nature and the living organism, it has this certain feeling of like life giving, this motion of giving life to things. And in the case of the tools and the security and everything, we used words like establishing and securing and maintaining. So, do you see the movement that I make with my hands? And that's kind of the feeling we get when we think about and talk about these things, and that at some point we're not able to describe them with words, but we can only look at each other and we're both knowing what we're talking about somehow, building things. Yeah, why do we do this? Oh, we want security, we want to establish things, stability, and in case of the nature, we want, it's life-giving, it's providing space for us to live and breathe. So there are certain energetic movements to all these things. And that's what archetypes are. Archetypes are basically the underlying energetic dynamics behind everyday things, that if you follow things all the way to their source and you're trying to find the motive or the movement behind it, that you run into a space where you can't say it, but you can feel it. You can intuitively grasp it somehow. And astrology uses these archetypes. And the first thing, let's say, when we stick with the example of the tool, okay? So the first thing we basically are faced with that we can word or name is the planet that the archetype is behind, or the planet is basically the face of the archetype. So in this case of the tools, we go all the way back to stability and establishing things. We're talking about Saturn, and we're talking about structure. And the first phase of this archetype is the planet Saturn. If you go behind that, you can't talk about it anymore. But Saturn is basically the first manifestation of this whole movement that I'm talking about, which is stability, establishing structure. That's what Saturn is about. Especially, I'm going to talk about this more in the next parts. Especially right now, we're talking about Saturn and Capricorn. We're talking about establishing structure, security, building, all these things that have a certain energy to it that's stable, that's there's the boundaries kind of feeling. And in the case of the tree, I would say we're talking about the sun, because we go all the way back and we ask, why is this providing this life? And the sun, the first thing that we know about the sun, or we can name about the sun, or the energetic movement behind the sun, is giving. It's life giving. It's giving of itself, and it wants to share itself. So that's nature right there. So the sun. Some people would say it's Venus, but there's other parts, I think, in nature that we would trace back to Venus. But in this case, I would say it's the sun. So this is just an example to kind of start understanding, okay, when we look at the planets in astrology, what they really are is manifestations of desire, or of energetic movement, of motive, And behind those planets, those symbols and all that, there's archetypes. And these archetypes cannot be named. They can only be felt. It's a little bit like, an example I have is, you have maybe a row of colored lights, and every light turns on at a certain time, and they have all different colors. You see the color, but you know that behind the color there's light, but the light doesn't have a color. So if we could only see colors, let's say, or we can only talk about the colors, but we cannot say anything distinctive about the light behind the color, because the light is just light. It's beyond us being able to describe it, other than it's light. It's bright, it's light, but yeah, then we run into problems, because it's the thing behind the color. So we actually look at the color instead of the light. And the color is the first thing that tells us something about what's behind. It might be a bad example, but it's kind of the metaphor I have in mind right now. So we always talk, when we say archetypes, we don't really talk about the planets or the signs themselves. We talk about the things that are behind the archetype, or behind the symbol, sorry. And the archetype is kind of a fundamental energy that creates our everyday existence. It's like a building block. You have a certain amount of building blocks, and those building blocks build reality, and build, your own psyche, and so on and so forth. And they're everywhere. These archetypes are found everywhere. Everything is connected to a certain archetype. So I hope that makes sense. Give me comments and questions in the comment section below. And remember, I do chart readings as well, and we do Enneagram typing as well. And I'm hoping to talk to you soon. Have a good day.